Yá'át'ééh. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Monday morning, March 28th. I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and we're not going to have a real long second cup of coffee this morning. One of the reasons is because we have kind of an exciting what's going on right now, but I'm going to have Renee Begay join me for a few minutes this morning. And then at around 11:15, 11:20, we're going to jump over to my Patreon, and we're doing a Q&A on my Patreon site. This is a follow-up to the conversation that we had earlier in the month. So my second cup of coffee that I had with Renee about 2 or 3 weeks ago was one of the most watched second cups of coffee on my social media this month. And so I wanted to bring her back for a bit of a follow-up. But then I also, we do a Q&A on my Ask Questions tier of my Patreon, and with a guest each month. And so she's going to be joining me on that. And if you want to sign up for that, you can always join us right now. I'm going to put the link for my Patreon into the comments section, and you're welcome to join that Patreon, and you can actually attend that Q&A live, or you can access that Q&A later if you'd like to do that. But before I begin, let me do as I always do, which is acknowledge that I am speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I want to thank the Piscataway for being the hosts of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So I'm going to bring Renee on right now, and if you have a thought or a question you want to put in the comment section, we're going to do a bit of a follow-up from last week, but I'm also going to go over a bit of news. So let me bring her on, and then I'm going to start talking about there's a news story I want to make sure we highlight this morning. So I see Mr. Phil Fox is here. I see Cordero is here. I see Cheryl Ann is joining us this morning. So thank you, my relatives. I know it's kind of early, especially on the West Coast and where you are in New Mexico, Renee. But thanks for joining me this morning. I think it's about a 9:15 your time, so your day's kind of getting going here.
Yeah, it's going.
But it's good to see you. I want to just highlight there's a story that started breaking last week and is going on right now. I'm going to first share this comment or this story in the New York Times. It's a hotel in South Dakota that threatened to bar Native Americans from the business. There was a crime, a shooting at the hotel last week. It was between two Native people. And the owner, in response to that, threatened to ban all Native Americans from the business. This, of course, has created an outcry throughout Indian country. And there's two stories I want to highlight for you here. One was in Indian country today, and it was a lawsuit filed against the hotel by a Native community. And then there was another story, and I want to comment on this one actually for a moment this morning, and I can even maybe get Renee's thoughts on it as well. But the Great Sioux Nation, and was in the Native News Online. Apparently, over the weekend, the Great Sioux Nation and their lands is where South Dakota is, especially where the hotel is. And by treaty, those are their lands, and their treaty apparently states that whoever wants to move onto those lands who is not native needs the express permission of the Sioux Nation. And so they actually gave a cease and desist order and issued a notice of trespass against the owner of the hotel that threatened to ban or bar Native Americans from their business. And I think this is fascinating. I love the way that the Sioux Nation appears to be approaching this, which is instead of crying, just crying, why don't you treat us better? They essentially said, we have a treaty that gives us right to these lands, and the treaty puts a condition on non-natives' presence on these lands. And if you are not going to behave properly, we are going to ban you from all these lands. We're going to bar you from living here, and we have the right to do that based on a treaty. Which again, I think I'm so grateful that the Sioux Nation is taking this approach, because these are the conversations I think we need to have, right? Instead of just, the white people won't let us do the things that we're trying to do. let's actually talk about, no, we have these agreements, we have these treaties, we have these lands that were established. And if you don't live properly within the context of these lands, we're going to work to enforce these treaties. So yeah, I encourage everyone to read those stories, especially the one in Indian Country Today and Native News Online, because it's important that you read it from the perspective of Indian Country, of Native America. And
Mhm.
so I encourage you to look at both those stories. What are your thoughts on some of these things around treaty rights and even with your own Zuni people, Renee? So first of all, thank you for coming back.
Mhm.
I received a lot of comments over the past several weeks of people who really appreciated our discussion. They loved the perspective that you brought in. They loved your poem, the poem that
Mm.
you shared. Um,
Thank
and
you.
I'm curious, as a Zuni woman from the Pueblo of Zuni, what is your nation's and your Pueblo's interaction with the United States of America, like through the notion of treaties, and how has that kind of come into your understanding and your experience as a Zuni woman?
I think, I mean, growing up, like I didn't really hear the word treaty. I think I've seen it more, through my readings and more of like a pan Indian experience where like I've seen the history of the United States with treaties and stuff. I just got finished reading Unworthy Republic by Claudio Sant. I think he wrote it like last year, but it was more of a administrative view of how the treaties were done, and how like the record keeping was taken and how the displacement began of native nations. And so I think for me growing up, like I didn't really hear the word treaty, but I've experienced it more with how our like how our pueblo is self-governing and how that is usually played out. And I actually got to grow up. My grandpa was lieutenant governor, and so I got to experience what it was like for him, to be voted in, and then also with his travels and all those things, and how he actually with the governor was able to go to Washington a lot of times to use the Reclamation Act of the artifacts, that the religious artifacts that were stolen from Zuni. And so I actually like would hear these stories at home and like hear of how he was, making change for our pueblo, and um, got to see more of just like the his experience. But then, when I graduated and started googling, what really happened, it's really neat. Like just googling how they used the Reclamation Act to go back to Washington D.C. and to reclaim those religious artifacts, and even just the way he did it, the way they did it was in a really good way. Where the article that I had was reading mentioned how they weren't forceful; they were just like at the sight of the religious artifacts, they started crying because they knew that this was a part of who they were and it was away from home, and that they were just, you know, with speaking from their heart, they just said like we need to bring these back home, and then they did. And so so that's just one story of what I remember, probably ways in which they used kind of like what the Great Sioux Nation did, of just the things that were already in place, or even just who we are, mixed in with like what's available. And so that's kind of my experience growing up.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who don't understand even the history of the Southwest and of the Pueblos. In the Southwest, the Navajo and the Pueblos were fighting the Spanish, the conquistadors, long before we met with the Americans,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we actually had the Great Pueblo Revolt where we kicked
Mm-hmm.
the Spanish out for about 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then they came back with tremendous force. And then it was Abraham Lincoln, right, who literally ethnically cleansed the area right through Gallup. I mean, the fact that the railroad goes right through Gallup, which is just above the Zuni Pueblo lands and goes right through some of the traditional Navajo lands, those lands were cleared by Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s.
Hmm.
And then when the Navajo came back from the Long Walk, we were then moved north of what's now I-40 and the railway, and the Zuni, of course, you were kept south of that area. And so the fact that there's this corridor of this freeway and this railroad that goes right through our that was established by the ethnic cleansing of Abraham Lincoln in completing the Transcontinental Railway.
Hmm. Wow. I didn't know that.
So
Yeah, it's
yeah,
kind of even in just this discussion, like we every tribe has different experiences. I remember even reading like what was his name? Collier? Was he like the secretary um, of Indian Affairs? But his like even just in his readings or his writings, you could see the bias of how he treated Navajos versus like Pueblos. And so like even just that, like learning all these things, like having this discussion, it's really, awkward for me to like just even read like the biases that these Indian agents had, and then how, why it was that way. So yeah, I
yeah.
didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a part of the whole reason with that railroad is there. I mean, that's just right. When you look at the history of Gallup, when it was established, it was right after Abraham, a decade or so after Abraham Lincoln ethnically cleansed that whole area and moved all the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache down to Bosque Redondo. And so
Hmm.
that whole area was left empty. And that's when they established the railroad, and then that's when they brought in the Gallup and established that city. So anyway, um, so yeah, I'm just curious. I know we've had you and I have talked once over the past month. Do you have any thoughts or anything as you reflected on the conversation we had last week? And we had a lot of really good discussion around your poem, as well as around sort of your engagement with Western evangelical Christian organizations and your own understanding of Creator. Are there any thoughts that you wanted to kind of follow up with, even thinking back, okay, it's been 3 weeks, this is kind of percolated in people's minds for a little bit, but is there anything that you wanted to kind of come back and follow up with in regards to the conversation we had a few weeks ago?
I do. It was a great conversation, and we were talking about, the things that you were wrestling with over the past 18 months. And I think for me, the thing that I'm have been concentrating most on in my faith, being grateful that my family had set this foundation of understanding and respect, even though there was like different perspectives and different religious views and things. I think just thinking back to our conversation, you know, when thinking of you, like when there are those of us that are really struggling and wrestling through something, whether it's about Jesus or our faith or things. There was a moment where I was like, oh, we talked so well about it, but then I was like, oh, we forgot to talk about our feelings, like I
Yeah,
was just like, I just really wanted to first of all acknowledge, you know, that wrestling that you've been feeling, how lonely it must have been to just be going through all these thoughts about why would Jesus treat, the Syrophoenician woman like this, or like others, the Gentiles this way. And and I feel like we're so quick to try to get to a resolution of like either a statement or like a faith statement, or trying to figure out, this is what I believe. But in a lot of times it's not clear cut that way. There's a lot of simultaneous things that we're feelings that are oppositional to each other or whatever. But I think the first thing that I forgot to do was just like acknowledge the wrestling that you had, to just be like, gosh, I'm sorry that you've been going through that. Like, how has it been for you? Like, how are you feeling on the inside? And what's it like for you to just be going through all these thoughts and stuff? And so I felt like, yeah, I wish we could just like practice that more often, to just say like, let's stop and talk about that. I mean, as comfortable as you are to share your feelings, but I think that just even acknowledges the humanity of what we're going through. So yeah.
That is really honoring of you, Renee. When I hear you say those words, it it touches a part of my heart that doesn't get touched frequently. Um, because my voice has been much more in the kind of the prophetic or the truth telling stage, I tend to get a lot more pushback or agreement, and I don't get frequently a lot of acknowledgement about the struggle of the journey.
Mm.
And so to hear you say that is really humbling for me. Um, I Yeah, that's really meaningful to me. So thank you
Mm-hmm.
for making that acknowledgement. And I think, because I spend a lot of my time in kind of cross-cultural environments and especially teaching and up front, uh, I forget the care that often gets expressed when we have these types of dialogues, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so thank you for that. That is
Mm-hmm.
deeply humbling, and I appreciate your acknowledgement of that. And I'm so grateful that you had some time to join me for this brief second cup of coffee. I know there's a lot of people who have been following you even on my Patreon, and I'm hoping. Well, we're going to start a Q&A over there in just a few minutes. I shared the link earlier on my on the comment section here. So if you'd like to jump over to Patreon in about 5 or 10 minutes, Renee and I are going to continue our conversation there. We're going to allow people to ask questions and to, whether it's something we talked about today or stuff that came up a few weeks ago when we talked. But there's a lot more that can and will be said, I'm certain. And so I want to thank you, Renee, for joining me
Mm-hmm.
today. I want to thank you for the perspective that you bring and just the reflective thoughts that you bring into the conversation. And yeah, I look forward to continuing this conversation over on my Patreon page. So, my relatives, thank you for joining me for the second cup of coffee today. I encourage you to go back and read those stories I shared
I
about
got
the.
my tea.
Yes, Renee is a tea drinker. She's not. She's not. What kind of tea do you drink, Renee?
Yeah, usually just like black tea. Yeah, black tea in the morning.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm drinking this is a good strong cup of coffee. So I didn't sleep as much as I'd hoped last night. So my final four bracket got completely destroyed over the
Oh
weekend. And
no,
so I don't have any teams. My daughter, who picked teams based on, I don't
your
know what she
seeds.
picked teams based on, but she beat me in the little pool that her and I were running together. So yeah, I'm kind of in a state of mourning about my final four teams this
Oh
morning.
no.
But
Oh.
yeah, well, thank you for joining me here, Renee. We'll jump over to
Yes,
Patreon.
thank
I
you,
want to
everyone.
thank everybody for being here. Let me see if there's any comments we want to highlight. Um, uh, I want to thank Belinda. Thanks for joining here. The Hot Soup is here. That is a really interesting name. So thank you, the Hot Soup, for saying good morning. Belinda also said good morning. Blessings from Oklahoma. We have Bob Harris, who is also saying good morning. So, yeah, my relatives, thanks for joining me today. And yeah, we'll jump over to the Patreon in just a few minutes. So, Hakonet, walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together.